Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is Dylan's Dart Sport. If you're new to this project, or in case you forgot, this is a 74 Dart Sport that was originally a Slant 6 automatic. I'm repowering this car with a Magnum-based 408 stroker, which has Edelbrock aluminum heads and all kinds of other nice parts, and a TKX 5-speed from Silversport. It's also getting severely upgraded suspension, 4-wheel disc brakes, and a Dana 60 rear axle. The basic premise of this build is upgraded drivetrain, lots of nice components, creating a very capable package that could be used for all sorts of things. Possibly some drag racing, some track racing, but mostly some vigorous driving on the street. The body of the car is staying exactly as you see it, and I for one love that. Now you haven't seen this project on the channel for a while, and as you can see, the Horde is slowly encroaching on its space. There are several, I'm not going to say good, but several reasons for that. For one thing, my friend Jordan had been coming up from Utah for weeks at a time to help me with projects just like this one. Having that help was great, but I no longer do. He got a real job, working on German cars for some reason. The bigger issue though is transmission to floor clearance. And of course we talked about that issue in the last video. Now the thing is, this is kind of my fault. I had done some research on this and I knew that in some A-bodies, you don't have to cut the crossmember or anything else to fit the TKX. This is not one of them. During our mock-up phase, we jacked the transmission up into position, and when we did that, we angled it slightly higher than it will be in normal operation, and the crossmember wedged right there in front of the shifter, and everything went into place, or so we thought. So we continued with the build as if we weren't going to have to cut anything. When it came time to final install the drivetrain, we learned that with the transmission at the correct angle, the crossmember bangs into that top shifter position that's unused on this transmission, and doesn't fit at all. Since then, we've gone through a couple different phases of trimming the crossmember trying to make it fit, and it still doesn't. At the outset of this build, we had this goofy Hurst crossmember setup that was designed to replace the entire welded-in torsion bar crossmember center section that you would have to cut out to fit a TKO 500. Because I didn't think we had to do that, we kind of cut the Hurst unit up, only to find later that it didn't work at all. So we scrapped that, and we ordered a replacement crossmember from Silversport that normally would have come with the kit. And that's where the next annoying issue comes in. Because when we called Silversport to order the crossmember that they build for our 74 Dart Sport, they said no problem. Obviously they had records of this order and they knew exactly what we needed. So on the invoice it said 1974 Dart Sport for Dylan. And then the line item for the crossmember said 1964 to 1966 A-body. So that's a problem. The bolt-in transmission mounting crossmembers for early and late A-bodies are not the same. They're very similar, but they're not the same. Now it's easy to tell the factory pieces apart because the early A crossmember only has one exhaust cutout over here on the driver's side. The passenger side is supposed to be just flat. Although as you can see on this particular piece, an extra cutout has been added for a second pipe. But it's not just that. They actually changed the width and the bolt mounting pattern, and so the early crossmember does not fit the late A-body, even though everything else in the cars is so similar. If you don't know, the front frame rails, K-member, track width, all of those things were widened in 67 on the late A-bodies, so again, differences here do make sense. The level of annoyance was compounded by the fact that it was the holiday season when we were trying to get this done, and getting it took forever. Anyway, now the correct one is here, and it's sitting under the car. Also, I need to ship this one back. So while I waited patiently for a crossmember and then another crossmember to come in the mail, I took on another A-body project that was supposed to be quick and straightforward. And it's still here. We'll talk about that later. Big, gigantic builds like this are complicated. All of the next important steps hinge on the drivetrain being in place. I can't set up the ignition. I can't wire the engine compartment. I don't necessarily know where the new brake lines need to be. I can't put the driveshaft in. I can't put the wheels on. I can't do an alignment. I can't bleed the brakes. I can't set it on the ground. I can't move it over to a 4-post lift to weld in the subframe connectors. I can't install the exhaust until that is done. So you see my dilemma. We kind of need all this to happen before I can move forward with the project. Unfortunately, this delay results in a loss of momentum. An incredible number of things happened on this build within the space of just a couple weeks, but now it's ground to a halt, and getting back to it is not easy. The number of factors involved is just insane. It's not just the work you have to do on a given project, but it's everything else in life. I mean, I've got videos to record, heads to rebuild, engines to assemble, projects to drag home, and the like. Anyway, it's finally time to get back to this project. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to accomplish on this one, but I do know I need to see that drivetrain installed. I need the driveshaft in there. I need all 4 wheels on this car, just for looks. They'll have to come back off later. A week or 3 ago, I did crawl into the car and scribe a new line on the crossmember where I need to cut to fit the TKX. Incidentally, that line goes onto the patch that we welded in place to strengthen what was left of it. Let that be a lesson to all of us. So I need to do that. I need to take the car up on the lift. As you can see, it's still hovering here where it has been for months now. It's somewhat precarious with no engine weight in the front. Currently, it's way too easy to do this with a hand under the front bumper. It was even worse when the rear wheels were hanging in there. They are steel and not light. Now at Rocket, when we're doing sketchy things like this, we generally use some ballast on the radiator support. We have like an egg crate full of brake rotors and a ratchet strap for exactly this job. Unfortunately on this car, I haven't figured out any great way to attach it. So what I'm gonna do instead is go up carefully, bit by bit, and then set my transmission jack under the rear end to help balance things out. As I've demonstrated in past videos, the factory type body drop technique where the drivetrain stays here and the car comes down on top of it is great, except for this little balance issue. So if you're gonna attempt this, obviously be careful or something. There you go. The illusion of safety. That is much better though. You just take a little bit of weight up on the axle and you can see the arms shift ever so slightly. Feel good about that. Now I don't want to move the drivetrain and K-frame assembly because it's currently perfectly aligned with the body. However, for obvious reasons, I don't want to get metal shavings and bits all over the new drivetrain. For one thing, getting foreign objects inside your engine is bad. Really, really super awful bad. For another though, any of the fine steel dust that's going to come out of this cutting operation that lands on this drivetrain and isn't removed will essentially turn to rust stains as soon as this thing is outside and exposed to moisture. And that too would be bad. As you can see, this crossmember is still in an unfinished state. Jordan had cut out that nice section in the middle and welded it in to back up the bars on the side there. And we were going to snug all this up, weld it, grind it, paint it, and call it a day. However, since we discovered it requires a bunch more modification, that operation kind of halted. What I have to cut is this. And again, a good part of that is the brand new material we put in. We'll still have about half of it there at the back. Something tying these two sides together at the top has always seemed like a good idea to me. But we are going to be taking out some of the strength we tried to engineer back in. After that's out of the way, we're going to have to decide if the floor itself needs to move or not. I think we need something like 1/2 inch of height. We're going to be gaining most of that by moving the transmission up through this, but it might still contact the floor. I suspect a little bit of hammer work right at those corners may be all it takes to make this work. I just got under here. Anyway, I started cutting. My mark on the other side. Alright, so there's one tack weld to the floor panel right there. Maybe it's 2. Whee! No! A snap-on screwdriver that's not a pry bar. All I had to do was turn the camera off and it came right out. Before ruining my favorite screwdriver in the world. Anyway, now we've got this. Yeah, you can see how much extra vertical space we gained there at the corners. And it might just fit now, but I'm gonna take the liberty of smacking the floor with a hammer anyway, just to make sure. Well, with a bit of hammer beating, I do think this is going to work. I'm gonna go ahead and be really optimistic and weld up all of this stuff and spritz some paint on it. Woo! Nope. Don't like that. Steady. Something like that. Okay, good news, bad news. As you can see there, those corners are a good bit higher than they were before. Something like 3/8 of an inch. We've gone past the cross member there, and we've got another 1/4 inch or so to the floor, so I'm good with that. At least for now, because back here where the transmission is a bit bigger, it's hitting on both sides. So we'll drop this whole thing down again and smack the floor with a hammer some more. It's incredible what one can get done with a ball-peen hammer and a dream. But as an extra insurance policy, I did go ahead and grind on the TKX transmission some as well. It was those corners there that were hitting, all 4 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we don't need any of that for our purposes. Also, there was a tag here that was really close, so I removed that. And I ground the boss behind that bolt a little bit as well. Same on this side, just for an extra little bit of security. Hopefully this is gonna work. We need something like a 1/4 inch gap at least around all of these areas. Steady.
Coming down?
Please do.
Ooh, and it went down like a 1/4 inch.
Probably should have started all 4 bolts though. Well, thank whoever. The drivetrain is attached and I think it can stay there. We're gonna go up now. We'll look all around the transmission and make sure we've got at least a 1/4 inch gap, but I'm pretty sure we do. Essentially what happened is once we got the cross member to actually fit and then set the transmission down on the rubber isolator, it squished it enough that it went back to the previous position we were in. And now we have all that extra room I made at the front, so we should be golden. While I was beating on the floor of the car, all kinds of interesting things fell down. This shock bushing hit me in the head. And this dart emblem slightly relieved itself from the driver's side fender. Yeah, it's the funky push style. Okay, future problem, I guess. There's the final height of the shifter sticking through the floor. Pretty confident the regular A-body 4-speed boot is gonna fit perfectly over that. Of course, it's oval too, so it'll cover all that. You can see those 2 spot welds like 6 inches in front of it. We're just gonna seal those. Hey, you found that thing we were missing. The speedo gear, which I can't see at all in your light. Yeah, there you go. We were gonna pre-install the speedo cable and gear, but we couldn't find the gear. Alan found it in the trunk. That figures. Yeah, you can kind of see those corners up there. Without the grinding or the beating, it would have fit, but it would have been really close. Now that we've done that, we've got room for the drivetrain to shift around under power and stuff, and hopefully it'll never hit the floor. Driveshaft installed. U-bolts torqued. That, of course, is a brand new piece. I think the company that made it is called like Performance Driveline or something. Anyway, we just ordered it through Silversport. They used to include these with their transmission kits, but you actually have to pay for them now. Now, I do have to mention that the fit to the transmission was a little bit tighter than I'm used to. After the first, like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 inches or something like that, I really didn't want to move, and I actually had to tap it with a dead blow. I did that back and forth several times, and it seemed to get a bit better, so I think it's okay. It doesn't seem to me like the yoke was excessively long or anything like that. This looks like a pretty standard extension, in my eyes anyway. And of course, it'll pull out a little bit more when the suspension is compressed. So I think it's fine. And if it's not fine, well, Silversport spec'd this driveline, and I measured it exactly as they called for, so I don't know, probably their fault. At some point, I am gonna have to cut that connector off to wire reverse lights. And on this side, we do not have a speedometer cable. Now that we've found the missing gear, I should be able to install that, but as you can see, there's not a lot of space. It's almost like it's supposed to go through that cross member. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, on the red 71 Challenger that we put the Hemi in, it had a 6-speed and it did go through that cross member. So I don't know what I'm gonna have to do here. It's a little bit later, and I'm putting the front suspension together, which is only slightly tricky this high in the air. This lift's really annoying to take up and down though, so I'm just kind of making it work. Anyway, essentially what you have to do is jack up the lower control arm just a little bit so you can swing the upper shock in. You also have to compress the upper shock to get it into the tower, but with the lower arm drooped all the way, the shock hits the frame or something up there, and it can't swing all the way in. So you have to raise it up just a little bit. With the shock installed, then you can bash the upper arm in place. I did show that in the front end rebuild video on this car. Just understand, sometimes it's really annoying and it involves a hammer. The current goal is just to get the front end together enough that I can put the wheels back on it and get it on its own weight on the ground. I need to be able to roll this thing rearward from the lift so I can get inside the car and install the clutch pedal, among other things. This is not going to be like a final alignment by any means. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. But usually when I install a set of offset upper control arm bushings like this, what I'll do is set the front cam bolt all the way out and the rear cam bolt straight up and down. And that generally ends up being pretty close to the final setting. If you're not hip to this, fasteners like the upper control arm bolts and the lower control arm bolts, also usually the strut rod nuts, are not torqued until the suspension is at ride height. Now, I don't have springs yet, or wheels, So that's kind of a problem. I can't really put vehicle weight on it to do that. But what I can do is eyeball the ride height I'm probably going to give it. And usually what I do is go for a little bit lower than stock, and it ends up being about my pointer finger's worth of a gap above the lower control arm's bump stop. So that's where I've got it set now. I'm going to go ahead and torque these things down. In the case of this car, because we're using a polyurethane lower control arm bushing, that one actually doesn't matter. That bushing is able to turn. I may have already torqued the pin, I'm not totally sure. I do still have to install my shock hardware, but again, the thing's like 8 feet off the ground. Interesting note here, because I torqued those with the suspension at ride height, when I let the jack down, it doesn't actually come down all the way, which is a bit of a problem for installing springs. If I pull on it, it might do it though. Tightening that bolt does a lot more than you might think. This is actually why some drag racers torque the upper control arms in a wheels up configuration, meaning with the suspension sagged. That way, the twist of that bushing actually helps to push the wheels downward and transfer weight when the car launches. It's quite a while later, and both sides of the suspension are together and torqued the way I showed you using the jack. I'm now ready to install the torsion bars. And there's some heavy duty buggers. These are 1.03 inch heavy duty torsion bars. Like I said, we're building like an all-around handling performance car here, and stiff springs are going to be part of the handling package. Unfortunately, I am out of time for tonight, so that and many other operations will be a tomorrow Jamie problem. Tell you what though, I'm getting excited. It's the next day and the Dart Sport is back in the air. So now it's time to install these gigantic aftermarket torsion bars. In case you're not familiar, classic Chrysler products from this era use torsion bars instead of, say, coil springs to suspend the nose of the car. Essentially, this end is locked into the frame and that end is locked into the lower control arm, and the twisting action produces a similar effect to a coil spring. It's better in several ways. For one, you can adjust the ride height by tweaking the adjuster that's in the lower control arm. For another, it actually resists bouncing a lot better than, say, a coil spring. The spring rate of the torsion bar is determined by its diameter. Now again, these are 1.03 inch aftermarket bars. The factory bars in a slant 6 car like this one would have been 0.78. I don't remember. A V8 bar or an AC bar is a little bit bigger to account for the extra weight, and they're like 0.82. I could be wrong. It's somewhere in that neighborhood. The point is, they're actually not that much smaller. 0.2 of an inch doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about the torsional rigidity of the bar, it really is. Generally, factory bars are not marked right and left, but these are. Also, in case you were wondering, these are PST brand, that's Performance Suspension Technologies. The bar is inserted from the rear of the car. There's a boot that's stuck onto the cross member there, which I'll have to force the bar through, and then it extends forward toward the control arm. I've already done it with the left-hand side bar here. It's wise to apply some grease to the socket ends of the bar. That'll allow it to slide into the sockets with less resistance. The biggest issue in installing them, though, is fitting the bar into the socket in the control arm. You'll know the hex here isn't aligned correctly if you're tapping on the bar from the back and it's just bouncing. When everything is aligned right, they should just pop right in there. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm way off currently. Something you'll often have to do to correct this alignment is reach in here and twist the little arm that's attached to the torsion bar key. Of course, this is the point that's used for adjustment. Tightening this bolt pushes the arm upwards, and that's what affects your ride height. Because this car has polyurethane lower control arm bushings, I can actually just kind of move this thing by hand. If you've got rubber bushings, if you've tightened that nut on the front of the control arm pin a little bit too much, you may actually have to turn this using a pry bar. Now, the clocking difference between the hex on the front of the bar and the back of the bar has the largest effect on how this socket has to line up. Notice on this aftermarket bar, it's actually twisted to the point that it is physically impossible for me to turn this far enough that way to line this flat up with this flat. So what I'm gonna have to do is push this adjuster up. That may well be because this bar is so large. To get the adjuster anywhere near a normal ride height setting, it can't be tightened in as far as it would have been if it was twisted to here. Even if you're reusing the factory torsion bars, the simple act of taking the suspension apart to rebuild it, replace the bushings and such, can totally mess up how that socket lines up. Even if your bar popped right out with no effort, by the time everything's back together, you may well have to finagle with this quite a bit. Now again, this is going to vary by the size of your aftermarket bar. But with this one, the way it's clocked, I had to put the adjuster almost all the way upward into the stock position to get this to line up. And I believe the reason for that is we're not going to have to preload this thing very much to get the ride height we want. I discovered that same thing with the red 71 Challenger. That car has gigantic torsion bars, and actually with the weight off of the suspension, the bars on that car can just pop right out because you can't put any additional preload on it or the front end will sit like a four-wheel drive truck. This, like other things, can vary quite a bit, but usually with stock bars, I find that these adjustment bolts end up somewhere between the heads flush with the bottom of the arm and about where these are now. So even though they're not actually tight against the adjusters, I'm going to leave them right there. We'll let the car down on the wheels and see what it looks like. I'm sure we'll be adjusting this to get the ride height where we want it at some point. The adjustment on your stock bar will never be loose like this. You're going to have it preloaded before you ever get the car on the ground. As you can probably tell, this linkage is just hanging together. I need to torque all the castle nuts, the pitman nut. I need to pin all of these, make sure I've got zerks everywhere. I've got most of them, but the lower ball joint ones are missing. And just generally go through and make sure this is good to go. I'll also randomly eyeball the toe right now. That, again, will be changed later, I'm sure. Okay, so my day got derailed by several different people showing up and buying a car. And anyway, I did get some more done on the Dart Sport. So here's your big reveal. Ta-da! It's on four wheels on the ground. I know not everyone is going to be excited about these big steel Krager wheels. At the time Dylan ordered them, he couldn't get the wheels he really wanted, and this was a good second choice. They may well get changed out in the future. I can tell you they're very heavy. Anyway, they're on there. Look at all this glorious, shiny new black and chrome stuff against this glorious baby poop yellow. Fantastic. My eyeballed alignment is way off on this one. Might be because of where the ride height's sitting right now. Because of that tall tire, actually it's further off the ground than you would expect from a suspension that's adjusted that far off the bump stop. We're gonna have to take it up just a little bit more. Like I said, I usually try and get something like a finger's width over the lower bump stop at least. You gotta have some suspension travel. Well, you don't have to, but you should. Most of the steering stuff is torqued now. I am missing some pins for a bunch of those joints, and I forgot to torque the idler arm. I also started hooking up the e-brake cables, and it's almost like they're both an inch short. Don't know what I'm gonna do with that just yet. The list of things remaining to do on this car is very long, as you know. But this is a momentous occasion. The drivetrain is finally in to stay, and it's back on four wheels. Unfortunately, as usual, I'm totally out of time, so this is where I'm going to have to stop for now. I keep hearing things from commenters like, "Why don't you ever finish any projects? We want to see you finish a project." All I can say to that is, you will see me finish this project. Not today. But I hope you'll stick with me. There's a lot more to come on this car. As usual, thanks for watching. And remember, can't dodge the Dart Sport. It's supposed to say Dart Sport. I swear I'm going to be late to my own funeral. Don't look at that.